That's a great story and a great storyteller. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, John, for doing the editing. Well, hello, everybody. We're on Luke's story of Paul's shipwreck, and it's such a great piece of storytelling with so much detail that people have been able to follow the route in yachts by themselves and to work out the timings and put together so much more of what's inferred in the text. It's actually a story that starts with the seasons, isn't it? I don't know about you, but being more into small pleasures during lockdown and now with the loosening up of precautions, it's made the summer more important than ever. Some of you, of course, are already on your holidays. Hope you're having a great time. Emma and Steve, Andy and Philippa, Helen and Bob are even travelling abroad to the Scilly Isles. But last week, our eldest granddaughter got even further than that because she went with a friend from Manchester to Malaga on a masked up plane. And in between sunbathing, she is spending some days remote working all the way from Spain. That's the new normal. If you're willing to fly, I guess. At the beginning of the year, Wendy and I thought about going to Crete, where Paul was holed up towards the end of September. But since digging into the story a bit more, I'm not so sure. I now know, according to the Roman military, that it wasn't safe to sail in that part of the Med after the 15th of September. And I don't enjoy storms much while I'm on holiday. Paul had transferred to a bigger ship. It was part of the fleet that brought grain across the Mediterranean and could carry 276 people as well as its cargo. That's no small boat. And because of bad weather, they were holed up in a harbour that wasn't great. And it was now the beginning of October. Outside of the limits of safe travel. The experts, the owner, the helmsman, wanted to move a few miles down the coast. They were positive kind of guys. Paul wasn't so keen. I don't know whether he was a weather freak, but he was oozing negativity. Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also. Now, Paul wasn't a sailor, but he wasn't short on experience either. By this time in his career, he'd already been shipwrecked 3 times and on one occasion had spent 24 hours in the water. But the decision had to be made, and the person who was going to decide for Paul and the prisoners was the Centurion who was in charge. Were they going to hang about for months, or were they going to at least move to a few miles down the coast where not only the harbour but probably the bars were better as well? The owner said its boat and its cargo of grain was safe. The helmsman said the weather was not going to be a problem. It seems reasonable that the experts won the day. Moving along, days into what had already become a catastrophic voyage. No sun, no stars, no GPS. They thought they were in danger of running onto sandbanks off North Africa. So they throw the cargo overboard and follow it with the massive boom that carries the mainsail. They weren't going to be needing that anytime soon. Nobody is eating. Everybody is feeling bad. Luke says, at this point, we gave up all hope of being saved. People are cold, wet, bruised, miserable, and very scared, rolling around the deck, throwing up over the side, hanging on to anything they can find. In this mess, Paul stands up and says, "You should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss." I love Paul, a man with the nerve to say, "I told you so." Sometimes We need to hear that to get our attention. Paul goes on to explain, last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. Paul knew who he belonged to, and he knew who he was serving. He was a Roman citizen, but he belonged to God, not the empire. He knew who he served. He followed Christ, not Caesar. Nevertheless, it looks as though he was afraid, and the angel, interestingly, didn't remind him of God's love. Paul already knew that nothing could separate him from that. Only a couple of years before, he'd written about God's extreme commitment in Romans 8. What shall separate us from the love of God? Instead, the angel reminded Paul of God's intention for him to go to Rome. In a previous crisis at night, God had stood near Paul and told him, you must bear witness in Rome. Now, in another life-threatening situation, God was running the plan by him again. In a military barracks, God had stood near. Now an angel stands by him. In both circumstances, experiencing God's closeness. Absolutely priceless. So, how does Paul's shipwreck fit with our stuff in summer 2020? Thanks for all the WhatsApp comments you've sent about lockdown. I think that Alan and Helen and Liz spoke for us all. Summer is not the end. It's a brief respite. Then we're probably back to the relentless storm that has been this spring. I don't know about you, but I found it particularly ominous with the government advice this week and all the press about losing weight and getting fit. Somewhere we've got to find the courage to thrive rather than survive for the next 9 months. And then hopefully with medication and vaccines, there will be some space. Knowing who you belong to is critical for knowing what matters at the moment. Knowing who you serve sorts your priorities. Knowing that God has a plan for you is a source of hope for the longer term. The series we did after Easter about learning to recognize Jesus is mission critical for next season. Knowing the presence of God is priceless. Apart from my lockdown kilos that need to be shifted, there are spiritual muscles that need exercising at the moment while the pressure isn't on to develop a strong core. Sort of spiritual Pilates is needed. Let's do like Paul. I want to be sensitive to the seasons without dreading what's to come. We can take account of the weather and make sensible decisions. We can lose those lockdown kilos and up the exercise. Sure, we can look at the news as much as is good for us. When Luke had faith in the probabilities and the circumstances, he gave up all hope of being saved. When the Centurion had faith in the experts, it didn't take many days to realise that even bright people don't have the data to make the best decisions. So if you're like me, avoid those late night long reads, anything with graphs and talk about confidence limits. It's not unreasonable to look at the clouds as long as you've got the right filters in place. Know who you belong to. Know who you serve. Know what God has called you to and factor those in. Exercise spiritual muscles now that allow you to draw close to God. Develop the core strength that means that you can experience his presence in the ordinary. That way, when push comes to shove, you will be able to say, I have faith in God. And because of that, you'll be able to tell the people around you, be of good courage, cheer up. Don't waste the summer. Follow the Spirit. Practice sensing God's presence. Get strong for the next season.